Hi, everyone. My name is Samantha Rose Hill. Welcome to week 5 of the Origins of Totalitarianism. I'm very excited this week because I am being joined, as you can see, by a brilliant scholar and also a very good friend of mine, Suzanne Schneider, who some of you may have the pleasure of knowing. Some of you have taken classes with her probably, and some of you will get to meet her for the first time today. But Suzanne is a historian, a writer, and a professor. She's currently a fellow at Kellogg College and at Oxford University, and she is faculty at the Brooklyn Institute of Social Research, where she was the deputy director for many, many years. She is the author of 2 fantastic books, both of which are very relevant to what we have been talking about and what we will be talking about today. The first is Mandatory Separation, Religion, Education, and Mass Politics in Palestine. And the second is The Apocalypse and the End of History. Couldn't be more timely. Modern Jihad and the Crisis of Liberalism. You also might have encountered her writing in the Washington Post, The New Republic, Mother Jones, Jewish Currents, Foreign Policies, or N+1, or many other places. She's one of the most prescient commentators we have about the rise of the new right at this moment. So please give a warm welcome to my special guest, Susie Schneider. You're welcome to say hi.
Hi, I'm somewhat embarrassed by this
Pleasure to meet you.
but it's lovely to be with you. I've been hoping to join for a few weeks. Kind of as Arendt is a perennial interest of mine, we just had to wait for Sam to come visit me in Oxford to make it happen. So anyway, thank you, Sam, for having me, and I'm looking forward to the conversation with everyone.
Yes, and I just to be transparent, I have invited Susie to interrupt and interject, and also give commentary at the end of my usual introduction to maybe talk a little bit more about maybe what Arendt gets wrong, or maybe what she got right and is still relevant. But Susie is the perfect person to do that. So let's go ahead and jump in. I said a few weeks ago that some of those early chapters on anti-Semitism were quite difficult to read. Arendt is making a number of what for many of us are uncomfortable arguments. But these 3 chapters in imperialism that we have for today are probably some of the most famous chapters in the origins of totalitarianism, and have been written about also extensively because of the way that Hannah Arendt is going to approach the question of race, which for her is central to imperialism, to the organization of imperialism, and is central to the rise of totalitarianism. So she's going to connect anti-Semitism, which, remember, so she's talking about how anti-Semitism fundamentally changes in the 19th century. And now she's going to take that framework and apply it to what she is going to describe as the transformation of race thinking to racism. So we're going to be talking about race thinking before racism, race and bureaucracy, and then continental imperialism, the pan movements. Okay, just 1 second. I'm going to go ahead and let one more person in. All right, so I want to just start by talking about 2 things before we dive into the reading. One, it's important to understand Arendt's idiosyncratic definition of ideology. Arendt has her own definition of ideology. It is not Marx's definition of ideology. It is not Althusser's definition of ideology. For Arendt, ideology is any word that ends with an ism. So capitalism, feminism, racism, Marxism, the transformation of an idea into a logic of thinking is her definition of an ideology. And like we were talking about it at the end of last week, ideologies divorce thinking from experience by telling people how to translate their experiences instead of opening space for people to tell a story and give meaning to their experiences themselves. So her definition of ideology, which we'll see in the first passage we look at, is going to be central to the way she gets from race thinking to racism. The second thing to be aware of at the outset of these three subchapters is her tone. We have Hannah Arendt's sardonic, scathing, critical tone coming through, especially the chapter on race and bureaucracy, in full force. She's going to describe imperialism as shocking. And she is going to go out of her way to shock the reader by taking full passages from authors like Joseph Conrad's work, The Heart of Darkness, in order to try and capture the shocking nature of racism. And those passages, which we can look at, are, of course, incredibly uncomfortable. And we can talk a little bit about what she's doing there. Rhetorically, the argument is that she is assuming the position of the imperialist to try and allow the reader to experience the shocking nature of that kind of racism. And it's, the kind of underlying argument, I would say, in these two chapters, the kind of central part of imperialism, if I had to put it in one sentence for you, is that, in Arendt's words, is that racism and classism are the two ideologies that might cause the destruction of the entire world. And so racism is central to imperialism. And in here, she's going to try and understand that relationship between racism, imperialism, and classism. Okay, so let's get into what that argument is. I'm going to break down the 5-step process of transformation from race thinking to racism. So Arendt, remember, is drawing together the elements of totalitarianism in order to show how totalitarianism emerges at this moment in history. And here we have two critical elements, racism and imperialism. And so what is the relationship between those two stars in the constellation of totalitarianism, to steal Walter Benjamin's language? Okay. So much like she argued in the chapters on anti-Semitism, she's going to argue here that the nature of race thinking itself changes into an ideology, an ism, in the 19th century, concomitantly with imperialism, because it's going to serve a very important functional role. It's going to be race becomes instrumentalized. And for Arendt, the political argument critique is that racism is pivotal to the decline of the nation state. Remember, it's a Pyrrhic victory. So Arendt's making an historical argument about the role that race thinking played in the rise of the Third Reich. And she's going to argue that there was a moment in time when race thinking still belonged to an earlier realm of politics, right? She's going to think about it as just a kind of idea that one has, right? But something fundamentally changes. Remember, an ideology is transforming an idea, a single idea, into a logic that then puts one in thinking into a mode of deductive reasoning. So race thinking exists, it's an idea. And then something changes during this age of imperialism, during the quote unquote scramble for Africa that happens at the turn of the century. So race thinking is transformed into an ideology that exists beyond, beyond practical political reason. And I'm choosing that language intentionally because part of what's going to be kind of underneath Arendt's argument here in this transformation is that the racists aren't really nationalists. They don't have any of those Kantian Enlightenment ideals about the nation or universal humanism or the importance of reason. Remember, we're in this space of instrumental logic. It's not about practical reason. That was a bit of a pun, I'm sorry. And so racism becomes weaponized by the state as an instrument of political violence. And race thinking became so dominant, Arendt argues, that public opinion eventually is going to adopt it without even thinking about it. And that moment, when the idea becomes so prevalent, kind of in the air, we might say, that the public adopts it without thinking about it, is the moment when it really becomes an ideology, an ism, so that one is already then experiencing the world through the framework of the ideology. Race thinking becomes racism. And so in Arendt's argument, she doesn't say it changes back. That's worth noting. So racism and classism are the two dominant ideologies that have won over the modern world. And they become unthinking patterns of thought adopted by society. They are ideological opinions, which means that they're not freely held, right? Last week we were talking about freedom and Arendt's definition of freedom in thinking and being able to tell a story about our experiences without ideology. So she says, for ideology differs from a simple opinion in that it claims to possess either the key to history or the solution for all the riddles of the universe, or the intimate knowledge of the hidden universal laws which are supposed to rule nature. And man, ideology is not a kind of freely held thought that one comes to on their own, whereas race thinking is now an ideology that we call racism. Okay, so I'm just going to go through the 5 steps quickly, and then I'll pause, see if Susie wants to jump in here, and then we can go more through the text. So the first step in the transformation from race thinking to racism is that race thinking becomes something that one kind of independently expresses. In the pre-19th century liberal framework, and again, I hear a lot of Kant in Arendt's argument, race thinking emerges as an idea that one puts on the table as in public debate about human difference. It's not an ideology at this point. And for Arendt, importantly, it's going to the second element is that it diverges from nationalism. So by the 18th century, figures like Boulainvilliers, who's central to her argument here, are going to use race to define group distinctions and separate from territorial nation-state nationalisms in order to justify certain elite privileges within society. And that discussion around Boulainvilliers is going to echo back to her discussion of the court Jews in the chapter on anti-Semitism. The third element of this is that race is going to take on an anthropological character. So the word ideology, just for fun, is French, idéologie, and it was coined during the French Revolution. And one of the examples Arendt's going to give of how we get to that initial usage and definition of ideology is zoology, right? And the way in which biology, and at the time, sorry, this is a bit of I'll put this in brackets, at the time, the kind of new fad in social psychology at the time as well was trying to understand human social relations from the perspective of studying animal behavior. And so this causes one of the key splits and moves sociology and psychology and anthropology toward behavioralism. And so in the 19th century, race thinking evolves into a focus on this kind of pure national character, pure ethnic character, where the emphasis is going to be placed on one's biology over culture. Okay, so then in the mid-19th century, in the discussion of Gobineau, Arendt is going to argue that racism emerges as an ideology and becomes a totalizing system. It is as she puts it, key to history, and the argument around racial mixing is going to be to blame for civilization's decline. And And fifth, and finally, is that imperialism is going to then institutionalize racism in the 19th century, and that it's going to materialize racism through colonial encounters. And this is where the example of the Boers appears. And we then see the relationship between the instrumentalization of racism as a form of violence and its defense being defended by the pseudoscientific justification in the language of biology. So those are the five kind of key markers that Arendt moves through over the course of the text. I'm going to pause there for a moment and see and see, and see. So what do you think of this argument? Thinking about, you know, especially the Jewish people as a race, or the instrumentalization of race in imperial practices, and thinking about the way in which the apparatus of the state is being used in order to expropriate labor.
I mean, I generally think that right colonialism has this ideological dimension, which is why, you know, Arendt was, for all of her kind of controversies on her writing about race, still kind of a key interlocutor for Edward Said. She's kind of all over Orientalism. And so the fact that imperialism has a kind of, you know, ideological justification in terms of human inferiority or civilizing missions, right? There's many different kind of glosses you can put on this. That seems to me almost commonsensical, but what doesn't seem right to me is the time frame that she's giving. And I'm wondering, you know, I'm not an Arendt scholar, so because so much of the focus is on the scramble for Africa and on the 19th century as this kind of high, in her opinion, kind of like the high moment of imperialism. But this is also when Germany really acquires an overseas empire.
Yeah.
But of course, there's a massive imperial framework for other European countries prior to the 19th century. So I have a little bit of hard time dating these trends she's kind of identifying it as kind of originating in the 19th century as there. Right, you have certainly ideological in her, you know, kind of way of thinking, justifications for empire, certainly well developed in the 18th century in British India, for instance, kind of in the Raj. You have them way earlier, arguably. You know, I was in Andalusia with my family in October, and one of the more interesting things that we saw there was when kind of we were in Cordoba, looking at some of the kind of like Jewish history, particularly around the Inquisition, and the ways in which there was already these how Christian ideas about heresy and kind of pollution actually seemed to be getting transposed in racial terms already in the 15th century, such that Jews, even if they had converted, even if you had a descendant that was Jewish, however many generations back, you could not be eligible to hold public office. I found this shocking in the 15th century.
What were the justifications for the racism in the 15th century before the biological arguments?
So I mean, it really, again, this is so out of my field because I want to like, you know, kind of say everything I'm saying here, you know, kind of. I'm sure there are scholars who work on, you know, the kind of 15th century Spain and can tell you this much better than I. But it seemed to me a kind of migration about kind of Catholic ideas about heresy and purity into a kind of biological register. And of course, throughout the entire colonization of the New World, it is very apparent, you know, that these people that they are encountering are not fully human. There is certainly an ideological justification that goes along with these kind of genocidal violence that they inflict. So it's not so much that I find her argument unconvincing in its kind of broad strokes. It's just that I'm struggling to understand why she kind of locates that in the 19th century, as opposed to pushing the timeline back a bit further. Other than there's two things that I, you know, kind of theorize. One is the kind of, yes, this is when Germany acquires its empire, its overseas empire, and that is kind of going to be a kind of key turning point for her. But the second is she is correct that something does change in the 19th century with regard to kind of scientific racism, the develop of eugenics. And remember, this is the most sophisticated stuff of the time. You have the kind of, I've been reading a lot of the kind of work of the eugenicists as for the book I'm writing right now. Kind of really the pioneers of statistics, the ways that statistics is embedded with kind of colonial and racist thinking, the kind of measurement of skulls, all of these kind of, things that we associate with kind of the eugenics movement. Right, it certainly changes. It certainly becomes kind of biologically and scientifically inflected. And eugenics is not, right. It's not controversial. Like it's true. That's the most astounding thing to me is like even some of the books that I've been reading that are kind of interwar books, we'll kind of make casual reference to eugenics as just like this is just a science that one has, right? I actually think maybe um, maybe in the future people will look back at us and be like, why did they speak about efficiency in this way? The way that I look at people and say, why do they think about eugenics as this kind of neutral thing that one could, it's just breeding. Who could potentially have a problem with this?
Natalism.
Yeah, I mean, so it's I think that something does change, obviously, in the 19th century and is around these kind of new scientific disciplines, new ways of quantifying, which are also kind of very much tied to the growth of the administrative state, right? Before you can be able to gather data on a massive scale and kind of compare it, it assumes a state apparatus that can kind of undertake that process to begin with. So those, and then I guess the final thing I was trying to understand is, there's obviously this movement in the social sciences in the 19th century toward the kind of biological and kind of scientific racism. But the other side of the social sciences is this real social determinism, that there are laws of nature or there are laws of society, right, that are just like laws of nature, just like we have kind of rules of gravity and planetary motion, that actually there are social laws that are just as determinative that, and for many of the sociologists, right, Durkheim especially, to say, what does it mean to say you have like a uniform rate of suicides every single year for these particular towns? How then do people even have some sort of kind of free will or agency within the system versus they're kind of wholly being determined by, whatever social factors are on the outside? So I'm curious to know to what extent Arendt engaged with that kind of the biological or the social. I mean, they're both deterministic positions at the end of the day, but they're different determinisms.
Yeah. They're different determinisms. So I think if I had to summarize the central question guiding Arendt's line of inquiry here, from race thinking to racism to the relationship between race and bureaucracy, or the administrative state, as you put it, it would be, how do we get from, you gave a beautiful example with eugenics, the development of eugenics. So here you have this idea put forward, which is not controversial. It's an idea, it's an argument. There's some level of scientific research that has gone into it. And Arendt's question is, at what point does an idea like eugenics become just widely accepted ideology that people don't think critically about or self-reflectively about, in a way that might cause them to question the veracity of this idea as something being amoral? And then I'm thinking of like personal responsibility under dictatorship, where she says that the social mores of a society can just change overnight. And that's what we saw happen in Germany. So what is that moment at which something like an idea with scientific support and evidence becomes a widely held public opinion that then becomes a public policy? And then I think the other word that you use talking about the 15th century is purity, right? And I think that that's central to this story as well, and part of that shock of imperialism. What is the relationship in that 17th, 18th century notion of man that demands this kind of purity that is then being challenged? Does that make sense?
Yes, maybe.
I mean, not that it's right. You get
I don't know. I've never actually thought about this before. So I could.
Good. It's a good question.
Yeah, it's a great question. But it's I guess there's a few different things that come to mind. One is this kind of idea of the kind of almost the Enlightenment man as the kind of perfectible kind of creature.
Yeah.
And and that has this kind of capacity for kind of continual self-improvement. um but then on the other hand, you have the idea of the kind of, of having to protect that figure maybe from the forces of darkness on the outside, right? Because, right, this is, of course, this is, this is not a Adorno and Horkheimer class, but
No.
it's an Arendt class.
But I do
But
talk about them
but
sometimes.
right, there is kind of, we have to square in our minds that the kind of Europe of Kant and of Goethe is also the Europe of the Holocaust. Like
Yeah.
that these things have to be thought together simultaneously, and that how is it in this kind of that the era of humanism kind of corresponds with the kind of dehumanization of, most of the globe,
Yeah.
and most of the peoples on the planet. And kind of my, the Saidian in me would tell you that those are not unrelated phenomena, and that kind of the process of kind of universal humanism, there is this kind of dark underside or kind of underbelly, in the, in that creation of the new modern man.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where my thinking goes on this. But what were you
Yeah.
thinking?
Well, I'm wondering about the romanticism as a reaction to the age of reason, and then the argument about how totalitarianism, in Arendt's view, becomes an extension of the inwardness of romanticism,
Hmm.
which turned individuals away from believing or trusting in their own sense experiences while also making them effectively isolated in their own being, so that the kind of sociality falls apart, making them vulnerable to ideology like racism. Is there something about that move from, you
Well, what's weird about the kind of romanticism argument is that, right, there's kind of an, particularly when it comes to empire, right, you have these
know,
two lines. On the one hand, you kind of, looking at people who live in the colonies, or, in what we now call it the global south. So on the one hand, you have the kind of noble savage line of thinking, where actually these people are more authentically human. They are rooted in that very romantic way in
yeah,
soil, in custom, in tribe, in
right,
tradition,
yeah.
right? That they're not alienated
And they
yet,
purify themselves in nature.
in, yes, in the way that kind of modern man has become alienated, right? So there is
Yeah.
this element, but in the actual, I don't know, like, I mean, I wrote my first book on, the British Empire, and like I spent a lot of time in the colonial archives. Like, this is not the way that actual colonial administrators talk about their subjects. They talk about them very much as from the rationalist perspective,
Hmm.
as, these are kind of children almost, right? Their kind of frontal cortex is not fully formed. They need to be kind of, it is a process of enlightenment. It is a process, not of kind of actually breaking them away from that kind of romantic view, and kind of training them in the kind of the kind of almost like enlightenment or kind of rationalist sensibilities.
Yeah.
So it's, I don't know, it's kind of hard for me to think about like the empire as being either purely rationalist or purely kind of romantic. It has these elements of both.
Yeah.
Mm.
Let's draw on a third term. I want to take a look at a little bit of the text together, which is nationalism, which also feels extremely relevant to what's happening right now. So Arendt is going to argue, I'm going to say a few things and then pull up a passage. She says Arendt argues that racism should not be equate it with nationalism. So this is also going to be part of the move from race thinking to racism, is that she's setting up the argument to describe the decline of the nation state. And she wants to draw a distinction between nationalism and the racism, which becomes instrumental to that administrative state, the bureaucratic state. And so racism for her is going to uh, remember, so imperialism is founded on expansionism. That is the underlying idea of imperialism for Arendt, expansionism. Racism is going to be inherently expansive, cutting across all national boundaries. And she's going to argue that racists have never made very good patriots, or representatives of nationalist ideologies of nationalism, because they don't share that kind of Kantian idea of a universal mankind, or believe in the rights of man, which is where the section on imperialism is going to end. And she's going to make this argument by talking about Henri de Boulainvilliers, pardon my French accent, a French nobleman who was a nationalist writing at the beginning of the 18th century. And he is going to depict the history of France as a war between classes or nations. And Arendt is going to argue that these notions are going to be central to racism and classism then in the 19th century. So he's going to talk about the Franks, the Germanic and barbarian warriors who served the rights of the Gauls, and he's going to talk about the true French nation. So again, we can also then think about Germany in this moment of expansion and empire and think about this idea of a true citizen. So that idea of a kind of universal humankind is at odds with the universal humankind is at odds with the particular notion of a pure citizen of a state which is particular. So this is going to come at the beginning of this transformation tied to the state. Let me go ahead and pull up screen share so that we can take a look at how she starts to lay this out. She says, oops, sorry, that's the later passage. Let's, no, yeah, there we go. All right. So the historical truth of the matter is that race thinking, with its roots deep in the 18th century, emerged simultaneously in all Western countries during the 19th century. And I'm going to slide down here. She says, until the fateful days of the scramble for Africa, race thinking had been one of the many free opinions, right? One of those ideas, which within the general framework of liberalism, argued and fought each other to win the consent of public opinion. One opinion among the many. You can also hear Plato here. Only a few of them became full-fledged ideologies. She's almost setting it up to think about it perhaps as a competition of opinions to become ideologies. That is, system based upon a single opinion that proves strong enough to attract and persuade a majority of people and broad enough to lead them through the various experiences and situations of an average modern life. For an ideology differs from a simple opinion in that it claims to possess either the key to history or the solution for all the riddles of the universe, or the intimate knowledge of the hidden universal laws which are supposed to rule nature and man. Few ideologies have won enough prominence to survive the hard competitive struggle of persuasion, and only two have come out on top and essentially defeated all others. The ideology which interprets history as an economic struggle of classes, Marx, and the other that interprets history as a natural fight of the races, Darwin. So to go back to Susie's question about the influence of sociology, Arendt is going to in part she's going to talk later about Darwin and the kind of idea of Darwinism and how it infiltrates political thinking to try and think of history as an evolutionary process. The appeal of both to large masses was so strong that they were able to enlist state support and establish themselves as official national doctrines, but far from beyond the boundaries within which race thinking and class thinking have developed into obligatory patterns of thought. Free public opinion has adopted them to such an extent that not only intellectuals, but great masses of people will no longer accept a presentation of past or present facts that is not in agreement with either of these views. Okay. And then she says, we get Darwin over here talking about the evolution of history from a scientific perspective. Do you want to?
I don't like this.
Uh-oh.
I can't square this with what I actually know about like the history of empire and the history of imperialism. And it's like it's not that
give us the other perspective.
I don't know. It's not that it's all wrong. It's just that like I would not. I mean, right. So for two things, first, just even going back to the nationalism, I think it's really a stretch to call someone a French nationalist at the beginning of the 18th century. I think we've had excellent social history, particularly of a kind of right. So that shows that the idea that the French that the not just that what intellectuals said, but what actual people on the ground who she purports to care about.
Yeah.
Right. What when was the time that they actually said that they were French? Really, not until the 20th century. So, kind of Eugene Weber's Peasants into Frenchmen is this masterful, enormous work on kind of, social history that shows, right, at the end of the 19th century, most people in France don't speak French. They speak various dialects. They do not talk about themselves as French. It's really in the First World War, even, you have these instances where the regiments can't communicate with different people who've been drafted from the provinces because they don't speak French. So, like, the idea that there was this, like, and his argument very much is the kind of anti-ideological kind of and I'm using that in a kind of more Marxian kind of way, much more materialist one, to say actually states make nations. Nations don't make states. And that it's actually not until you have a state, a modern state, that can have a unified school system, a system of roads, national commerce, an organized national economy, kind of new transport links. These are the things that enable people to think about themselves as living in a nation, and that someone who lives in Marseille has some sort of inherent connection to that with someone who lives in Normandy. And those things don't exist prior to the modern age. So I would just kind of like push back even against the way that she's thinking about nationalism as something that seems to be kind of free floating and apart from all of those material, structural, and administrative features that good social history tells us are actually necessary to kind of create nationalism as a robust fact on the ground, not just for an intellectual class, but really on the ground. Yeah. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that the kind of the binary between race and class is hurting my brain. It's like, no, I'm sorry, like because, and I guess and part of this depends on to what extent you can fold imperialism. You think about imperialism as an extension of a logic that's inherent in capitalism, versus in thinking about it as its wholly different kind of subset. So I approach imperialism as something which is very much inherent in the logic of capital. And so similar systems of enclosure and exploitation, right, that are actually, that are developing both in the metropole and the colonies in different ways, but kind of simultaneously, and they kind of feed one another. And so I think that we lose some of that kind of connection if we think about like that class is something that occurs in Western Europe and race is something that occurs in the colonies, as opposed to thinking about the ways in kind of a much more like to kind of anticipate a W.E. Du Bois or C.R.R. James about the ways in which kind of race becomes the framework in which class is experienced. So that binary is just not sitting right with me.
So I think that binary is, so Arendt is holding them apart from one another because she wants to understand the relationship between the two. Because for her, they're not inherently connected to one another. But you want to say, no, that's wrong. They are inherently...
I think they're inherent parts of capital.
Parts of capital. That would be the organizing.
That would be my... But I guess I'm falling into the ism. No, and then not that, right? And not that they're... and there are excellent critiques of kind of this kind of Marxism is not the kind of skeleton key to all of kind of historical analysis. There are instances in which people's kind of where economic kind of considerations and material conditions are not the driving force of history, and you have to be able to be alive to the points of kind of of exception, or points where things are just like much more complicated than like a unitary explanation would offer. But yes, I would say that these things are inherently related. They are inherent to the kind of logic of capitalism, and it's puzzling to me that she doesn't want to really quite go there
to thread that needle. I want to go back to the first point and ask, since I know you're an expert on this, thinking about this, so then maybe moment in the 20th century where we have a clear exposition of what we would call ethno-nationalism. But before that, how is it during this golden age of imperialism, scramble for Africa that she's focusing on? How is it that these nation states are, I want to say, interacting with each other? How do we understand the transformation from these independent nation states to the expansion of the administrative state with the emancipation of businessmen into politics and imperialism and colonialism.
It's like 17 questions stacked on one, but I'll allow it. Only and inevitably only get like very partial.
Thank you, Professor.
Do you want to ask what like the meaning of life while you're
Tell
at
me the history of the nation state. I'll ask about that later.
I guess very quickly, right. So the 19th century is this period of kind of consolidation of nation states, which actually means that it's often the kind of unification. So right, in both the case of Germany and the case of Italy, right, you have these kind of processes in the second half of the 19th century of kind of unifying various provinces, kind of putting them together and saying, waha, we have a Germany now, right? We don't just have a Prussia or this or that, right, or Bavaria. Now we have Germany. Now we have Italy. There's this very famous quote by this Italian statesman after the kind of Italian wars of unification, which exactly goes to my point that it's the state that creates the nation, not the other way around. He says, we have Italy, now we have to make Italians. Right?
There go my people, I must lead them.
Right? And to think about these things as material processes that have to be enabled by things like, do you have a national school system? Like, are kids literally being taught in the same language? Can they communicate with each other? Do you have a system of, yes, roads, commerce, things that would kind of allow oneself to think of oneself, we can talk about this in the kind of, Benedict Anderson's kind of theory on nationalism, that the role of the emergence of like newspapers and novels and kind of print capitalism in vernacular languages that allows people to think about themselves suddenly is connected in a new way. So you're like, oh, actually, I don't just belong to this little like valley over here. I somehow have some sort of innate connection to these people who live, 400 miles away, but are technically part of my same nation now. So like, I really don't think there's anything natural about the nation. So this is like this is the first thing that nations are kind of are created, and they're often kind of created by the state. And then in terms of the kind of question of it's almost a question of like the bourgeois revolutions. No?
Yeah.
Right? In terms of the kind of the businessmen being kind of emancipated and but again, this too seems to be capitalism, right? This too seems to be.
But what happens to the state with the bourgeois revolution?
Well, I mean, a few things, right? You have a transition from what's going to be the center of wealth creation. I mean, this is like very, very, broadly speaking, right? Once you move to societies that are no longer chiefly agrarian, where the kind of land is the source of wealth, to societies where actually it is trade, industry, kind of commerce, and all of the related trades that go around that. So whether that's law, whether that's banking, finance, right? Those things all actually require a lot more like tabulation and record keeping. So these things are actually quite key, like that shift from kind of land-based wealth to merchant-based and kind of trading-based wealth is quite key to what you're talking about in terms of the kind of growth of an administrative state, because suddenly you have to, like, your wealth is coming from things like customs.
Right.
Your wealth is coming from things like taxation. Exactly. No, precisely.
Tariffs.
And this is not the case when you have a kind of, land-based, like kind of like quasi-feudal society.
Yeah.
So of course the businessman has to be emancipated from, kind of these like, these old strictures. Although again, I mean, this is really different in every European